My boss fired me to promote his nephew. He didn't know I owned the company's biggest client. My name is Samantha. I'm 35, and for 11 years, I worked as a senior account director at a mid-sized marketing agency, the kind of job where your entire value comes down to relationships, the accounts you land, the clients you keep, the trust you build over years that a single bad quarter can't undo. I built one relationship in particular so carefully over 9 years that it eventually became 40% of the agency's total revenue. My boss fired me on a Friday afternoon to make room for his nephew. He assumed the client would simply transfer over with the account, the way clients always do on paper. He didn't know that client was a company I quietly co-owned, and that the woman on the other end of that account wasn't just my biggest client. She was my business partner, and she'd been waiting 9 years for me to finally walk away. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people face impossible moments and walk out with their dignity intact. If you've ever been treated as replaceable by someone who never bothered to understand what you actually built, this story is for you. Drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happened over the following 6 weeks is going to stay with you. Let me back up, because you need to understand the agency before you understand what my boss actually threw away. Harrow & Vance Marketing was a mid-sized agency in a mid-sized city, 42 employees, the kind of place that had a handful of loyal, comfortable clients, and one client so large it functioned less like an account and more like the load-bearing wall of the entire building. That client was Delacroix Home Goods, a home furnishings company that had grown over the 9 years I'd managed their account from a regional chain with 11 stores into a national brand with distribution in over 400 retailers and a direct-to-consumer arm that had, in the last 3 years alone, tripled its digital revenue. I'd been the one who pitched Delacroix originally, back when I was 26, and Harrow & Vance was a smaller shop trying to punch above its weight. I'd been the one who sat across from their then marketing director, a woman named Renata Delacroix, and convinced her that our agency, small as it was, understood her brand better than the larger firms she'd been courting. Renata took a chance on us, on me specifically. Over the following 9 years, as Delacroix grew from a regional player into something much bigger, our relationship grew alongside it, not just professionally, but into something closer to an actual partnership, the kind that develops between two women who've spent nearly a decade solving each other's hardest problems. I need to explain something here, because it matters enormously to everything that happened later. 3 years ago, Renata came to me privately, outside of any agency context, with an idea. She was launching a new venture, a boutique consulting arm advising other home goods and lifestyle brands on the exact kind of growth marketing strategy that had worked so well for Delacroix, and she wanted a co-founder with real agency experience, someone who understood both the creative and the operational side of scaling a brand. She offered me a 20% equity stake in exchange for advisory involvement evenings and weekends, entirely separate from my day job at Harrow & Vance. I said yes. I structured it carefully with an actual attorney to avoid any conflict of interest with my employer. My equity stake and advisory role were in Renata's separate consulting venture called Meridian Brand Partners, not in Delacroix Home Goods itself, and I never once used Harrow & Vance resources, time, or client work product to support Meridian's operations. I disclosed the arrangement in writing to my boss at the time, framing it simply as outside advisory work with no conflict to our client relationship, which was true, and which he'd approved without much interest, because he'd never been the kind of manager who read the fine print of anything that didn't immediately affect his own compensation. Over 3 years, Meridian Brand Partners grew quietly alongside my day job. Now advising 6 other consumer brands, generating steady revenue I reinvested rather than drew from, because I'd always intended it as a long-term asset, not a quick payout. My 20% stake in Meridian, by the time this story happened, was worth, on paper, just over $340,000. But more importantly, it meant Renata and I weren't simply agency and client anymore. We were, in every meaningful sense, business partners who trusted each other completely, and had for years. None of my colleagues at Harrow & Vance knew any of this beyond the vague, approved disclosure buried in an HR file nobody ever looked at again. My boss, Gerald Harrow, was one of the 2 founding partners of the agency, 61 years old, the kind of leader who'd built something real decades ago and had spent the last several years coasting on relationships other people, mostly me, actually maintained. His nephew, Colton, 28, had joined the agency 18 months earlier in a junior account role after finishing an MBA he'd taken his time completing, and it had been obvious from nearly his first week that that Gerald intended for Colton's career trajectory to move considerably faster than his actual performance justified. I want to be fair here. Colton wasn't incompetent exactly. He was pleasant, presentable, good in a pitch meeting where charm mattered more than substance. What he was not was someone who'd ever actually managed a client relationship of any real complexity, let alone one worth 40% of the agency's revenue. He'd sat in on Delacroix meetings a handful of times as a junior observer, taken notes, occasionally contributed a competent but unremarkable idea. He had never once led a strategic conversation with Renata, never once handled a crisis on the account, never once been in the room for the harder conversations that actually keep a 9-figure client relationship intact over nearly a decade. I found out I was being pushed out roughly 6 weeks before it happened, though I didn't understand at the time what I was actually seeing. Gerald began scheduling Colton into more and more Delacroix touchpoints, framing it as shadowing for succession planning, which sounded, on its surface, like reasonable business continuity. Every agency wants a client relationship that doesn't live entirely in one person's head. I didn't object to that framing because it was, in principle, correct practice. I even helped structure some of the transition documentation myself, walking Colton through account history, creative rationale, budget structures, because I genuinely believed at the time that Gerald was thinking about long-term account resilience. What I didn't know was that Gerald had already decided quietly that resilience wasn't the actual goal. Replacement was. I found out on a Friday afternoon in March, called into Gerald's office at 4:30, the time slot every employee in every company instinctively recognizes as the one reserved for bad news you're not meant to have time to process before the weekend swallows it. Gerald didn't waste time with preamble. Samantha, we've decided to restructure the account leadership on Delacroix. Colton's going to take over as lead moving forward. We think it's the right move for the agency's next chapter, and honestly, we think it's a good moment for you to think about what's next for your own career too. I sat very still, the way I do at work when a number doesn't reconcile with what I'm being told. You're removing me from the Delacroix account? We're restructuring leadership, he repeated, the specific corporate euphemism people use when they want the effect of a decision without the discomfort of naming it plainly. We think Colton's ready. And frankly, Samantha, we think it's time for some new energy on that account. You've done great work, but we want to see it evolve. And what does that mean for my role at the agency overall? Gerald's smile stayed fixed in place, but something behind it shifted. The particular expression of a man delivering a decision he'd already finalized long before this meeting began. We think, given the restructuring, it makes sense for us to part ways. We'll do a generous severance. Obviously. 12 weeks. We really do appreciate everything you've built here. 12 weeks of severance for 9 years of building the account that had funded roughly 40% of the agency's entire payroll, delivered on a Friday afternoon with the phrase new energy, doing the heavy lifting of dressing up nepotism as strategy. I asked the obvious question, the one I already knew the answer to but needed to hear him say out loud. Is this because of Colton? Gerald's composure held for exactly one more sentence before something more honest slipped through underneath it. Colton's family, Samantha. He needs a real opportunity to grow into something significant, and Delacroix is the account that can give him that. I think you'll understand, from a family business perspective, why that matters to me. There it was, not a performance review, not a client complaint, not a strategic pivot the agency had genuinely debated. A 61-year-old man deciding that his nephew's career trajectory mattered more than 9 years of relationship equity I'd built with the agency's single largest client. And assuming, apparently without a second thought, that the relationship itself would simply transfer over the way an account number transfers between spreadsheets. I appreciate you telling me directly, I said, and I meant that part sincerely because at least he hadn't dressed it up as a performance issue, which would have been worse. I do want to be clear about one thing, though, before I sign anything. Have you spoken with Renata about this transition? We'll be looping her in next week once the internal announcement goes out, Gerald said. I don't anticipate any issues. Colton's been shadowing the account for weeks now. She already knows him. I nodded. Thanked him for his time in the specific flat, professional tone you use when you're no longer employed somewhere but haven't left the building yet, and walked out of his office with a box of my belongings by 6 that evening. 12 weeks of severance in an envelope, and a quiet, growing understanding that Gerald had made a decision without asking a single question about the actual nature of the relationship he was about to disrupt. I want to explain something about how I felt driving home that night because I think some of you will recognize it. It wasn't primarily anger, though there was some of that. It was the specific, cold disorientation of watching someone dismantle something you'd spent 9 years building with total confidence, based on an assumption they'd never bothered to verify, the assumption that a client relationship is simply a line item that transfers with the paperwork, rather than something built slowly and specifically between two particular people who happen to trust each other. I called Renata that Saturday morning, not as a strategic move, not yet, but because she was my friend and business partner of 3 years. and she deserved to hear what had happened to me directly, from me, before Gerald's carefully worded internal announcement reached her the following week. She was quiet for a long moment after I explained everything. The restructuring language, Colton, the 12 weeks of severance, the assumption that the account would simply transfer. He's going to email me next week introducing Colton as my new lead, Renata said slowly. Like I'm a piece of furniture being reassigned to a different room. That's roughly the framing, yes. Samantha, I've worked with you for 9 years. I don't have a relationship with Harrow and Vance. I have a relationship with you. Colton observed a handful of meetings where I mostly talked to you across the table while he took notes. I'm not sure he ever fully understood. I didn't respond to that immediately because I didn't want to be the one to suggest what happened next. I wanted it, if it happened at all, to be entirely Renata's decision, made with clear eyes and without any sense that I'd manipulated her into it, because our partnership had always been built on exactly the kind of straightforward honesty Gerald had just demonstrated he didn't understand the value of. What are you thinking of doing? I asked instead. I'm thinking, Renata said, that I've spent 9 years building Delacroix's marketing strategy around a specific person's judgment, and that person just got shown the door on a Friday afternoon, so a 61-year-old man could hand his nephew a 9-figure relationship he's never actually built anything real inside of. I'm thinking Gerald is about to learn that he never actually owned this account. He just billed against it. Here's what happened over the following weeks, and I want to describe it carefully because I didn't orchestrate a takedown. I genuinely didn't. I answered honestly when Renata asked me questions, and I stayed entirely out of Delacroix's internal decision-making because inserting myself directly would have crossed into something unethical and, frankly, unnecessary, given what was already unfolding on its own. Gerald's introductory email to Renata went out the following Tuesday, cheerful and confident, announcing Colton as the new lead on the Delacroix account, framing the transition as an exciting evolution for both companies. Renata, by her own account to me later, responded politely and professionally, requesting an initial transition call to understand the new team structure, the kind of reasonable, unremarkable request any client makes when an account changes hands. That call happened the following week. I wasn't on it, obviously, and I didn't hear about it until days later. But from what Renata described, it went about as well as you'd expect a call to go when a 28-year-old with 18 months of junior experience is asked cold to speak with real command about 9 years of brand history, creative rationale, and strategic direction he'd only ever observed from the back of a conference room. Colton, according to Renata, struggled to answer basic questions about the reasoning behind several long-standing creative decisions I'd made years earlier, based on specific data and specific conversations with Renata that had never been fully documented anywhere beyond my own working knowledge and hers. He deferred repeatedly to getting back to her on questions that any account lead with real command of the relationship would have answered immediately. Gerald, who'd joined the call to lend authority, apparently spent most of it praising Colton's potential in the abstract rather than demonstrating any actual command of the account himself, because Gerald, despite being the agency's founder, had not personally led a substantive Delacroix conversation in at least 4 years. Renata ended the call, thanked them for their time, and told them she'd be in touch. She called me that evening. Samantha, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, not as my friend, but as someone who actually understands what I'm about to consider. Go ahead. If Delacroix moved its marketing relationship away from Harrow and Vance entirely, would you be willing to lead that relationship independently, either through Meridian directly or through a new structure we build specifically for it? I sat with that question for a long moment, because I want to be honest that even in that moment, with everything Gerald had just done, I still felt the instinct to be careful, to not appear as though I'd been angling for this outcome from the very beginning. I'd want to think it through properly, I said, and I'd want it done in a way that's completely clean. No poaching allegations, no ambiguity about how the transition happened. But yes, if you're asking whether I have the capability and the willingness, the answer is yes. Good, Renata said, because I've already spoken to our general counsel, and Delacroix's marketing services agreement with Harrow and Vance is up for its annual renewal in 5 weeks. I don't intend to renew it. I want to pause here and be precise about something, because it matters both ethically and legally, and because I think it's the actual heart of this story. I did not solicit Delacroix's business away from my former employer. I did not reach out to Renata suggesting she leave. I did not use any confidential Harrow and Vance materials, strategy documents, or proprietary processes in anything that followed. What I did was answer Renata's direct question honestly, as her existing business partner in an entirely separate venture, about my own availability and capability, something I was fully entitled to do, especially given that my employment had already been terminated and any non-solicitation provisions in my original employment contract, which I'd reviewed carefully with my own attorney before responding to her question, applied specifically to actively pursuing Harrow and Vance's existing clients. not to responding honestly when an existing personal business partner asked about my own future plans. Renata's decision not to renew the contract was entirely her own, made as the client based on her own experience with the transition call and her own assessment of where her company's marketing leadership actually resided. That distinction mattered enormously, and I made sure throughout the following weeks that every conversation I had was appropriately careful about exactly where that line sat. The next 5 weeks unfolded largely without my direct involvement, though I heard about most of it through Renata, who called me periodically simply because we were friends, and because she was, understandably, frustrated by how the situation continued to unfold on Harrow and Vance's side. Gerald, apparently sensing that the transition wasn't going smoothly, scheduled additional calls, brought in the agency's other founding partner to add gravitas, even attempted at one point to bring me back in as a paid consultant just to help smooth the handoff. An offer Renata relayed to me with something close to disbelief in her voice because it revealed more clearly than anything else that Gerald still didn't fully understand what he'd actually done. He wanted my expertise back, quietly, on a contract basis, while keeping Colton publicly positioned as the account lead, wanting essentially to have my competence without my title, my name, or my compensation attached to it. I declined the consulting offer, not out of spite, though I understand if it looks that way. I declined because accepting it would have meant propping up exactly the arrangement that had just been used to discard 9 years of relationship building in a single Friday afternoon meeting, and because, frankly, Renata had already made clear she had no intention of continuing to work with Harrow and Vance regardless of who quietly consulted behind the scenes. 5 weeks after my termination, on the exact date the annual services agreement came up for renewal, Delacroix Home Goods formally notified Harrow and Vance that it would not be renewing its marketing services contract effective at the end of the current 60-day transition period required under the existing agreement. I found out from Renata before Gerald did, which felt, I'll admit, like a small and specific kind of justice, though not the kind I'd engineered, simply the natural consequence of the fact that Renata trusted me enough still to tell me things before she told the people who'd just spent 5 weeks demonstrating exactly why that trust had never really extended to them. The fallout inside Harrow and Vance, from what I heard secondhand through former colleagues who stayed in touch, was significant. Delacroix represented, as I mentioned, roughly 40% of the agency's total revenue. Losing it wasn't a setback the agency could absorb quietly. Within 2 months, I heard, there were layoffs. Not Colton, notably, whose uncle's loyalty apparently extended further than his actual usefulness ever had, but several account coordinators and a junior strategist who'd had nothing whatsoever to do with any of it. I want to be honest that I felt genuinely conflicted hearing about those layoffs, because they were the actual innocent casualties of a decision Gerald made unilaterally, weighing his nephew's career against a relationship I'd spent 9 years building without ever once asking a single question about whether that relationship was actually as simple to transfer as he assumed. I hadn't wanted anyone else to lose their job over this. I'd simply wanted to be treated honestly, and I'd wanted the people who dismantled that honesty to understand the actual cost of what they'd done. 3 months after my termination, Meridian Brand Partners formally onboarded Delacroix Home Goods as its newest and, by a wide margin, largest client, with me leading the relationship directly as both an equity partner in Meridian and the account's dedicated strategist, a role that combined finally in one place both the ownership stake and the operational leadership I'd spent years building separately and quietly. The financial outcome, I'll admit honestly, was significantly better for me than anything Harrow and Vance had ever offered. My 20% equity stake in Meridian, once Delacroix's business came fully into the venture, appreciated substantially, and my direct compensation for leading the account, structured as a founding partner rather than an employee, exceeded my previous salary by a considerable margin. But I want to be clear that the money, while real and significant, wasn't actually the part of this story that mattered most to me. What mattered was this. Gerald had assumed, without ever once verifying it, that a 9-year relationship was simply an asset that belonged to his agency, transferable at will to whoever he decided deserved it next, regardless of whether that person had ever actually earned the trust the relationship required. He never once, in the entire 6-week unraveling, called Renata directly to ask her honestly what she needed or wanted from the transition. He never once asked me, in our final meeting, what specifically made the Delacroix relationship work, or whether it could genuinely survive being handed to someone someone with 18 months of junior experience and a family surname that happened to match his own. He assumed ownership of something he had, in the most literal sense, never actually owned. The account had never belonged to Harrow and Vance. It had belonged to a relationship between two specific women who trusted each other, built patiently over nearly a decade through actual difficult conversations and actual hard-won results. A relationship, no severance agreement, no internal restructuring memo, and no nephew's resume could simply reassign. I ran into Gerald once, about 8 months after everything settled, at an industry conference neither of us had expected the other to attend. He looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do, I suspect, with the particular exhaustion of watching a business you built slowly shrink because of a decision you can't take back. He approached me at the coffee station, hesitant, and said, with what sounded like genuine if late honesty, "I underestimated what you'd actually built there. I want you to know I understand that now." "I appreciate you saying that," I told him, and I meant it, because there was no value left in being unkind about something that had already resolved itself so completely without requiring my anger to finish the job. "I hope Colton's doing well, wherever he landed." "He's actually doing account work at a smaller shop now," Gerald said, "learning it properly this time, from the bottom. I think, in hindsight, that's probably what should have happened from the beginning." I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that it absolutely should have, and that the entire situation could have been avoided if Gerald had simply asked one honest question before that Friday afternoon meeting. Not, "How do we make room for my nephew?" but, "What actually makes this relationship work, and can it survive being handed to someone who hasn't earned it yet?" I just nodded, wished him well, and went back to my table where Renata was waiting, mid-conversation with another client we'd since brought on board together. Here's what I learned from a Friday afternoon meeting that was supposed to end my career and instead simply redirected it somewhere better. Some people believe relationships are assets that belong to whoever holds the org chart, transferable on command, regardless of who actually built the trust inside them. They're wrong, and the market eventually tends to correct them, quietly and completely, without anyone needing to raise their voice. I didn't get revenge by sabotaging anything. I got it simply by continuing to be exactly who I'd always been. Someone who built real relationships, honestly, over years, with people who valued substance over surnames, and by letting the people who'd underestimated that discover, entirely on their own timeline, exactly what they'd actually thrown away. If you've ever been treated as replaceable by someone who never understood what you actually built, you know exactly how it feels to watch them finally understand it, months later, standing at a coffee station, several $1 million and several jobs too late. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.